I think election day is probably an important day to remember that climate change as an issue of climate change is not really an electoral issue in India and not in many countries. And is not likely to be one and perhaps shouldn't be one in the near future. But it is, as an indirect driver, hugely salient to things voters do care about. Energy, water, vulnerability to natural disasters, agriculture, health, and so on. And I think one reason climate governance is so tricky and so hard to talk about is because links between all these issues and climate change are really hard to express politically and really hard to work into governance systems. So this panel discussion is really motivated by three observations. The first is that there is growing evidence of the urgency of climate change, and this urgency is buttressed by strong messages from the IPCC, some misleading reporting around the fifth assessment report, Working Group 1 in the Indian press notwithstanding. I think the IPCC did send actually a really clear message. The second theme is that there is limited attention to climate change in most political systems around the world. You see debates around climate change being swamped by issues around financial crises, short-term concerns in most countries. But somewhat paradoxically, there have been this proliferation of both subnational efforts, non-state efforts, and by states, efforts to create national plans, strategies, and so on, that by some recent research we did at CPR, suggests that 67% of global emissions are now under some form of plan or strategy, are covered by some form of plan or strategy. How useful are these plans and strategies? What is the meaning of all this action? How do you square it with a lack of political attention in most countries? This is another sort of theme and issue we'd like to explore. Third, at the global level, we are moving towards a Paris 2015 moment, which in the eyes of some might be as visible, if very different in tone and tenor, to a Copenhagen 2009 moment. The Warsaw COP is just concluded. Few people would declare it a vibrant success. People are still trying to decompose what it actually means. Decompose perhaps being an unfortunate metaphor. Deconstruct probably is better, yes. And so we have this question about what is the global climate regime actually going to look like? These are all big questions that will require some hard thinking. And fortunately, we have a panel of big thinkers, experts, and others to help us do this. This is a panel that we'll introduce them in a minute. But these folks are here for a conference, a workshop of academics working on climate governance, globally and nationally, that CPR has pulled together. Many others are in the audience here, and we'll call on them as and when they may have things to add to the conversation. And we will try and have this be as facilitative and sort of a open-ended a conversation as possible. Since we need to have really big thinkers for this occasion, we have asked Ambassador Saran to introduce this event. And among his other roles, Ambassador Saran is a senior fellow at CPR and has graciously agreed to give us a few opening remarks and to introduce the panelists. To briefly introduce Ambassador Saran, who is extremely well known to most of you, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that he is perhaps the most influential strategic thinker on Indian foreign policy of the last 2 decades. And I say personally as well that one thing that has struck me, and we've been fortunate to have him at CPR, is that whether you agree or disagree with him on a particular issue, he's always happy to engage intellectually and to have robust discussion. And I personally have benefited a lot from this, and I thank him for that. In terms of the formalities, there is a very long list of accomplishments and titles. I will be brief. Ambassador Saran has been India's Foreign Secretary. He's been Special Envoy for the Indo-US Civil Nuclear Deal. Also, as we all know, and the capacity we know him best in, Special Envoy on Climate Change and Chief Negotiator. And he's currently Chair of the National Security Advisory Board and Chair of the Research and Information System for Developing Countries. So, Ambassador Saran.
Thank you very much, Navroz, for that very generous introduction. It's with some trepidation that I agreed to make the opening remarks at this interaction today. Firstly, because I have been out of the loop, as it were, for the last 3 years, although I have followed climate change negotiations from the sidelines after having been right in the center of things. And secondly, because frankly, my own view about what's happening with respect to the issue of climate change is that, frankly, nothing is happening. So there is very little in terms of what I can say, which may be somewhat encouraging with regard to what unfortunately has been a steady decline in momentum and steady decline in interest in climate change issues after a tremendous momentum had been built up going up to the Copenhagen Climate Summit. I think it was a lost opportunity because we had virtually all the major leaders of the world present at Copenhagen. There was tremendous amount of public opinion, international public opinion, which was in fact driving leaderships towards a climate change agreement. And ultimately we ended up with what I can only describe as a whimper, because I still remember very clearly the very last day when the leaders of the basic countries, India, Brazil, China, South Africa, were meeting together to decide how they were going to articulate their sense of disappointment at what had not been achieved. And then President Obama walked in, and we came out of this room with essentially what was described as a major achievement, but it was not. So since then, I mean, whatever little was even achieved at Copenhagen, frankly, if I look at the scene since then, it has been really, even from that very low level, since then it has been actually a race to the bottom. So what can we expect in Paris? My sense is that what you will expect in Paris is precisely what the United States wanted in 2007, 2008, which was essentially it would be a pledge and review system. That is, countries will pledge what they feel they are able to do in terms of their commitments for reducing emissions, for what they may be able to put into the kitty as far as financing for climate change action is concerned. Very little on the technology side, because this is linked up with IPR issues, commercial issues. And you would have all this essentially subject to some kind of an international review with no compliance procedure whatsoever. Compliance only in terms of maybe some public opinion, but certainly no compliance of the kind that we have incorporated in the Kyoto Protocol. So if we are speaking about urgency, Navroz, if we are speaking about humanity facing an elemental challenge to its own survival, if we look at that challenge and if we look at what we are heading towards, there is no correspondence between what we say we are faced with and what we are prepared to do. Yes, as you have mentioned, there are actions which countries across the world are taking with what may be described as climate change actions, but many of these actions are driven by other considerations. If the United States of America, for example, if the emissions are stable or if they are going down, it is because there is perhaps a shift from coal to gas. Okay, so that is some small mercy. But all over the world, if you look at what the fundamental issue with respect to climate change is, that unless you are able to make a strategic shift from your current reliance on fossil fuels, driving economic activity, driving economic growth, unless you make a shift from that to a strategy of growth which is based essentially on renewable sources of energy, essentially on clean sources of energy, I don't think there is much hope of dealing with the issue of climate change. And yet, if you see what is happening in the world today, there is actually a resurgence of fossil fuels as the drivers for economic growth. In just one area, oil and gas, one estimate is that something like $700 billion are being invested in new facilities for oil and gas production. Now, these are long-term investments. These are investments not for tomorrow or day after. These are investments which are going to have outcomes over the next 20 years, 30 years. Where is the hope of being able to make that shift that is necessary if we are able to deal with climate change? And if you look at the price of carbon, for example, in the European market, I think perhaps it must have gone down to 3 or 4 today from something like 30, which was supposed to be a little cutoff. So that is the depressing situation that we face. So I think when we are talking about a sense of urgency, or we are talking about how countries are doing something to be able to meet this challenge, I think it is too little, and perhaps I'm beginning to think that it is a little too late. So this is really, if one is honest, this is the challenge that we are up against. Now, I think it is very timely, even on election day, that we have such a distinguished panel to really grapple with these issues. And I would be absolutely delighted to hear if they have some, bright spots that can perhaps dispel some of the gloom that I have successfully, I think, created enough in this room. That would be great. I think we have, as Navroz said, a panel here which is very distinguished, tremendous scholarship, especially in climate change related issues, energy related issues. And I'm sure a very rich treat awaits all of us. So let me conclude by just introducing the panel to all of you. We have Professor Michael Grubb, who's Chairman of Energy and Climate Policy, University of Cambridge, and he's also Editor-in-Chief of the well-known Climate Policy Journal. We have Yuba Sukona, Co-Chair of the IPCC Working Group 3.
Sorry. We got a very last minute cancellation.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry.
I meant to tell you that outside.
Okay, no problem. So we have Mr. Teng, who's Associate Professor from Tsinghua University, and he's the lead author of the 5th assessment report of the IPCC. Mr. Xolisa, Council of Scientific and Industrial Research from South Africa, and Michele Betsill, Professor, Colorado State University. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking time off from what is going to be the main preoccupation for you in the next couple of days to come and spend some time with us. And with that, I hand over the responsibility for conducting the rest of the session to both Navroz and Lavanya. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many of us have been to a lot of seminars in this building and in this room, including Lavanya. I should actually formally introduce Professor Lavanya Rajamani, my colleague at CPR. And in discussing how we would handle this today, we thought that we would depart from the norm a little bit and also challenge ourselves by trying to be, if not talk show hosts, then at least facilitators of a more interactive conversation. So this is new for us as well, so please bear with us. But we're going to try and make this a little bit more interactive than your normal IIC chai and samosas panel discussion. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pose a few questions to the panelists, ask them to respond relatively briefly, give people in the audience also a chance to come in every now and then, and see how whether we can generate an interesting discussion. The broad sort of structure is we're going to talk about what is happening at the national level in many countries to begin with, and then sort of bridge over to talk about the international level a little bit. And I thought we might start with Michael Grubb, and ask you, Michael, if you would, to tell us a little bit about the UK's domestic climate governance structure, and in particular the UK Climate Change Committee, which gets cited a lot as perhaps the most cogent example of domestic climate governance. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and both the things it's achieved and the challenges you've faced.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll try and give a brief summary of that and just add a few thoughts as to where UK and Europe stand. Not that I wish to add to the depressing tone of the, the opening, but I think one thing we'll learn from Copenhagen is that realism is important, providing it's tempered by a sense of where one can go. Now, the UK, I know, has attracted quite a lot of international attention for its climate legislation. So let me give a very brief sketch. The preface would be that the UK Climate Change Act, which is the central legislative piece of the architecture, obviously did not arise out of nowhere. It actually reflected a process, I would say, of more than 15 years of cultural and political development in Britain, which I think was very helpfully kicked off under a Conservative government led by Mrs. Thatcher, brought in the business community, built up a general sense that climate change science was serious, that it was both an economic challenge and opportunity. The key would be stable policy. The business community broadly came along with that. The challenge was then seen as how do you actually marry the nature of an issue like this with the need, the realities of politics, shall we say, with the need for long-term consistency and a framework that business actually feels confident to invest in. The culmination of those kinds of debates led to legislation that was adopted with something close to unanimous, certainly very strongly bipartisan support across the House of Commons and the House of Lords in Britain, which was the Climate Change Act. And since Navroz asked me, just an outline. What that legislation does is essentially say the UK will put in primary legislation a strategic commitment for 2050 to reduce emissions by 80% compared with 1990 levels. And it will set up an institutional and legal architecture to help guide the UK towards that objective. That architecture will be centred around the concept of 5-year emission budgets, so total emissions over a 5-year period, which are to be set in legislation at least 15 years in advance, and to try and ensure some analytic rigour in the process of setting those carbon budgets. There is set up an independent committee on climate change. Now, there was a lot of debate, both about the powers and remit of that committee and its constitution. I know quite a few people in government were actually quite uneasy about the potential importance of this independent body. Though, as I'll stress, it doesn't actually take decisions, but the structure makes it highly influential. The decision was that it would be an expert committee, not a stakeholder committee. Very fundamental difference. And it was a surprisingly small committee. Its legal responsibilities were to recommend to the government of the day what carbon budget should be, sequentially, at least 15 years ahead. To produce an annual report on the UK's progress towards those carbon budgets, and if its judgment was the UK was not on track, to recommend policy responses to get the UK back on track. Now, some interesting things in this. First, you'll note the committee doesn't decide, but it recommends, with the under the authority of the Climate Change Act, to Parliament, to the government, what the target should be. The government has a legal obligation to adopt a carbon budget. It could choose a different number. The problem is, it's really quite difficult to explain in the House of Commons why you would adopt a different number from the one recommended by your own expert advisory committee. And you can be pretty sure the opposition is likely to try and do tear apart your position. So far, the committee has recommended 4 carbon budgets. They start in 2008, so the 4th one is for 2023 to 27, and the government has accepted all 4 recommendations. The first 3 went through with very little trouble indeed. The 4th one was a much bigger political battle in the cabinet that had to be resolved by the Prime Minister, but it was pushed through with the the recommendation. Some adjustments in definition with respect to aviation and international offsets. But the basic structure so far has withstood the kinds of pressures generated. Now, what about the progress? Monitoring, reports to Parliament, not very exciting. Note, reports to Parliament, not to the government of the day. But the key thing really is that if the committee judges the UK is not on track, it can recommend the policies required to get back on track. Now, one of the things the government absolutely insisted was that the committee should not actually be a policy advisory body, because the last thing the government actually wants is for an independent committee to poke its nose into government implementation policies. And so the government has quite a strong incentive to kind of keep on track using its preferred policies, rather than, in effect, by falling short of the trajectory, give the committee the authority to recommend what it should do instead. So again, there's an incentive framework built in. Now, all of that architecture was put in place in a period, through a process I've outlined, and also in a context of a political history which I wonder if we will ever see again, frankly. Namely, I think a real political commitment to climate change in its own right as a major strategic objective of global concern with a responsibility for the industrialised countries to lead. That was the psychology, the political framing, and the Climate Change Act was simply the UK's embodiment of that sentiment in, maybe I shouldn't even say Europe, but Northwest Europe. Things have changed, and I think it's quite important to understand just how much they've changed. The political environment in Europe since the recession in Copenhagen has gone backwards. Many factors are contributing to a change of sentiment, obviously which starts with the failure of the Copenhagen deal, the sense that actually we have other priorities, financial, the still teetering state of the Eurozone. The slowdown of global temperatures obviously has not helped. The US shale gas revolution, which is seen to be exposing the higher energy cost issues in Europe as a real concern for European industry. Many other factors are feeding into a scepticism emergent in Europe. And there are certainly forces at play in the UK to try and undermine the architecture. When I say forces at play, it's a very complicated situation. The government is now unusually a coalition led by the Conservative Party. The Prime Minister is still broadly emotionally committed to wanting to do good on climate change and convinced it's a real problem. He made a statement to that effect after the Philippines typhoon. But he's dealing with a minority, but an extremely potent political minority, which is pushing together not just an anti-climate sentiment, but a kind of more isolationist, right-wing, frankly. It's not our problem anymore, we're a small island, it's a problem of the developing world. We don't really like these stupid European regulations we agreed to. Generally, a sense of real political rebellion in part of the Tory party. Now, I shouldn't say more about that. I can see Navroz beginning to get nervous about time. I don't want to be too depressed because the commitment is still there within the government and the majority within the government. But my sense is that will hold, the basic position being David Cameron is not going to revoke any existing commitments. He needs new ones right now like a hole in the head. Therefore, the government will sit on it till the general election in spring of 2015. You then have to see what that election brings, which is very likely, if it's a Conservative government, to be contingent upon what Paris brings. So the fundamental difference is I do not see UK or Europe being in any sense in the position of unilaterally, willingly leading things. It's going to hinge on whether there's a sense that actually the rest of the world really is alongside doing stuff as well. That, I sense, is one of the key political shifts that has now occurred in Europe.
I think the part that's always interested me about the UK story is the fact that you have actually put in place a regulatory structure based on information and recommendation, but with a sufficient, with actually some leverage over the decision-making processes. So that's intriguing. Of course, it's a little disappointing that other industrialized countries haven't seen it appropriate to follow suit. And of course the political picture you painted is not so promising. So we're going to have to turn, as we often do here in India, to China to look for signs of hope, new developments, perhaps a new direction to go. And maybe Teng Fei, you could tell us a little bit about what is going on in China, very briefly, because if you told us everything that's going on in China, we'd be here for quite a long time. But maybe your sort of top one or two things that you think, policy-wise, are really the big-ticket items, and then a little sense of why those have been made possible.
With regarding to the question that has been posed by Navroz, I think firstly, I would like to update several changes which, according to my observation, may be important and may be interesting for all of you. The first one is, I think the first one observation is the driving forces of climate change policy is changing in China in the past several years. But for many years that was in China, the climate policy is driven by a combination of different factors. The international pressure, the domestic interest, including both energy and environmental issues, because of those issues are quite linked with climate change. And about 1 decade ago, that the climate change issues has been framed as international affair issues. That is why that about 1 decade ago that the negotiations in the UNFCCC is led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China. But then this driving forces has been shifting from the international affair towards the energy concerns because of the people realized that most of the carbon dioxide emission and also greenhouse gas emissions in China is mainly due to the combustion of fossil fuel. That is why the NDRC, one of the leading planning agencies in China, began to take the leadership from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then climate change policy in China partly has been considered as a part of the energy policy. That is why you can see in the 11th five-year plan was the energy intensity target has been considered as part of our mitigation efforts. The reason for that is because of this. And since the last year, the most recent changes, you can see more and more stronger driving forces. In fact, it's coming from the air quality and air pollution issues. This has been a very hot debated since last year. The very serious fog and haze problem in China, especially north of China, has driven this change. The reason is because of the particular matters, which is the main cause of the fog and haze issues in China. Is almost half of those particular matters came from coal, and coal is dominate fossil fuel in China. So if you want to improve air quality, the most strict method is to reduce your coal consumption, and that has a huge implication on the emissions. And then when the government is shifting towards more stringent air pollution policies, they found more ambitious mitigation policies. That is generally the change of the driving forces in the past decades of China, the changing from international affairs to energy and then to the environment. And at present, that environment concerns is one of the binding constraints in China, according to my personal observation, because of if you have a very stringent constraint on coal consumption, and that means that you have to reduce your carbon emissions substantially. That is why in the most recent environmental policy package, the coal cap policy has been considered in several relatively developed areas in China. And the government is also seriously considering that to impose this coal cap policy in whole China instead of only part of them. And about several years ago, if you came to China, if you talk about this peaking of emissions in China with the key experts in this area, you will find that a majority of them think that will be difficult, almost impossible. And if you talk with the government officials, almost all of them think this is impossible. But at present, if you came to China, if you talk about these peaking issues with Chinese academics and officials, you will find some of them, and even most of the experts, began to believe that it is not only possible but also necessary for China. So that is a change of the dynamics. And the second change I'm going to talk about is the change of the instrument, the policy instrument that we are going to achieve this. The most important change is we are shifting from the traditional command and control policy towards a more market-based mechanism, including both emission trading scheme and also maybe possible the carbon tax. In the previous 5-year plan, that generally the traditional approach of China we are doing is to allocate our nationwide target to different province, and that province to allocate this target to different cities to counties to firms and enterprises, and we use this command and control policy to do this, which is very effective because of as hierarchy system in China, the government has a very strict control in this aspect, but it is not cost effective because of there's no trading happens, and you lose the efficiency when you gain the effectiveness. And for this 5-year plan, China began to shift towards a market-based mechanism, especially the emission trading scheme. That we have the emission trading pilots in 5 cities and 2 provinces. 3 of them, the Shenzhen city, Shanghai, and Beijing, have started the real trading in this year. Just last week, that Beijing is the third city-level ETS which started trading in China, and which is a very big shift, which is going to sign a very clear policy signal and price signal to the market, and which is going to channel the investment towards a more low carbon pathway. And the third change, I also like to.
I think we probably should move on, because otherwise we'll come back to you for a little bit more. But
Okay.
you want to just mention
Okay.
the third one and maybe not describe it?
Okay. I will mention the third one, but not getting into detail. The third one is you can see a dynamics with a shift from the national government-driven politics towards a more local government-driven politics, and can observe more and more local government activities in this area, and we'll come into this in later stage.
Seems like there's several positive developments, and I was really struck by the fact that the peaking of emissions is something that academia, at least in China, is now beginning to see as not just possible but necessary. I was also struck by the salience of domestic drivers and domestic concerns, as it were, in terms of climate change policy and framing of climate change policy. And in that context, actually, I was wondering if I could turn to Xolisa and ask him if you have a similarly sort of positive take on what's happening in Africa. I mean, the Africa Group has been sort of mobilizing itself in the negotiations, and you've come up with several very positive and progressive sort of proposals in the recent past, the RF being the equity reference framework, or the principle-based reference framework being one of them, which we will come back to later in this discussion. But I was wondering if you could tell us if, in the context of this Africa Group mobilizing, there've also been Pan-Africa initiatives taken that could cast a sort of more positive light on where we might be going.
I think education perspective, without getting into the equity reference framework aspects for now, Africa is at a crossroads. In that you will know that the level of development in Africa leaves much to be desired, to say the least. And if you look at a number of countries, particularly in East Africa, there's a lot of fossil fuel finds that have come up. And the biggest dilemma is how do you deal with those, having the development that you have, yet on the other hand, trying to be responsive to global or international imperatives. And I think at this stage, this is where the international community can play a leadership role, because I think we have a right to develop, and we've got this alternative, this fossil fuel alternative that we have, and which is at this stage the easier route towards achieving the development imperatives. Now, the importance of the international community and an international agreement is how can we realize what we've been talking about in terms of tunneling through the development curve. You know, despite the availability of these resources, how do we get international support to invest in alternatives, whether those are available? I think in some countries, though, if one looks at particularly North Africa, as well as in Southern Africa, there are a lot of positive things that are happening. If I can use South Africa as an example, we have adopted a national climate change response policy. And of course, it is balanced between how we invest in adaptation as well as how we transition into a low carbon economy. And there are some interesting things that some colleagues on the floor, like Harald, will provide specific details in terms of how much investment in renewables have been generated through shifts in policies. For example, we've got a renewable independent power producer scheme that the government is funding. However, one of the biggest challenges is that the scale of capital investments that is necessary is such that South Africa by itself cannot be able to achieve those. But those are the green shoots that I mentioned. And I can't avoid mentioning Ethiopia as another example, because in Ethiopia there's a big dam, the Millennium Dam, which is entirely funded from domestic and citizens' inputs for the country, and it's likely to deliver a good developmental benefits, yet on one hand avoiding investment in fossil fuel energy sources. So those that's the blessing that Ethiopia has from a hydro and water perspective, and there are several other examples waiting to be tapped within Africa, like in the Congo, etc. So there are options that can avoid locking into fossil fuel investments or assets, not contribute to the 700 billion investments, but decisions and international support is central.
At the risk of sort of moving from very positive to positive sort of presentations to perhaps some gloom and doom, perhaps I could call on Jennifer to talk about the US climate policy.
It's great to be here amongst an amazing group of people. So thank you for including me. I think the US is a mixed story right now. On the one hand, I think the understanding of the risks of climate change to the United States has never been greater. So, and that is the unfortunate case that the impacts are happening. Sea level rise is happening in Florida. There's 5 counties that has a large portion of the American coastal community that's dealing with saltwater intrusion, that are working together to try and figure out what to do about it. There's a pine bark beetle outbreak in the Rockies with millions of dollars lost in forests and homes being collapsed. There's droughts. Well, there are 11 events over $1 billion last year, right? And for the first time in a long time, that's been linked in the media to the issue of climate change. So, and you have a new task force at the White House that's out doing things. So on that level, you have actually, I think, there's a huge amount of activity on the local level on resilience and impacts, with a narrative starting with impacts. Then you have the administration that I think, from our analysis, is doing almost everything it can with its existing tools. So I don't think it's only because of shale gas that emissions have gone down. It's a mixture between shale, the economic recession, and regulation, which is the opposite what you just heard from China, which is rather interesting. The US is going away from markets into regulation because there is not a functioning congressional ability to do anything about much of anything, including climate change right now. So you have regulation on cars and trucks, you have regulation on appliances, and you have a proposal on the power sector. That's the big debate right now, is how far they will go in reducing emissions from new power plants. There's a reg out right now, and they have to regulate existing power plants pretty soon. And there, obviously, shale gas helps on the economic side of things, but it is a huge political debate right now because coal is a very strong constituency in the United States still. So, but on the longer term, I think there's obviously still a huge amount to do. I think you have a very engaged, from a foreign policy piece, which will come to Secretary of State. You have a president who's raising it quite a lot. And you have bubbling kind of things going along. But going into a post-2020 time period, trying to get congressional legislation passed, we still have a lot of work to do on that side.
About how countries structure their energy systems and their governance systems and so on and so forth. But it's not just about countries by any stretch of the imagination. One of the things that's been very interesting has been this profusion of activities outside by non-state actors and by networks of state and non-state actors. And I'm going to turn to Michele Betsill here to my right to ask, perhaps if you could tell us a little bit about both your work on cities, documenting particularly what's happening on cities, as well as this idea of transnational climate governance that you've been writing about. And what do you think both the potential of that approach is, and also to maybe anticipate some of the skeptical questions and say, well, how far can that really take you?
So, a long time ago, I worked on the multilateral treaty negotiations and did some research on the Kyoto Protocol negotiations. And I came away from that thinking, wow, this is a really tough context, and you know, a lot of people working really hard, but the political dynamics are such that I'm not convinced a lot could happen at that level. And, there was a footnote in my dissertation back in the late 1990s talking about cities. There were some city representatives at the Kyoto negotiations, and I thought, this is so curious. Why are cities involved? This is a big global issue. Countries are dealing with it. What's going on? And I sort of turned around and looked at what cities were doing, and you know, over the past decade, that's where I've seen sort of these glimmers of hope, because you know, while you read the media reports or go to the conference of the parties, and there's sort of these gridlocks and stalemates, almost every day you can read about new activities going on at the local level. So cities have been engaged on the climate issue since the early, really mid 1990s, and you know, there's lots of, they're often motivated for reasons other than climate change, and in fact, some of the networks that were promoting local climate governance actually used that to their strategic advantage and said, oh, you're interested in air quality. Well, here are some things you can do to address air quality, and oh, by the way, they also reduce carbon emissions, or quality of life issues, or what have you. And so I think the trend that we've seen over the last 15 years is that that's moved from being something involving small and medium-sized cities, largely in the industrialized world, to now where you know, major global cities across the developing world are taking climate change on as something that is within the authority of local governments. And if you think about you know, what local governments are responsible for doing, there's actually lots that can be done. So the extent to which they have authority over land use planning, over providing energy, transportation infrastructure, waste disposal. So there's sort of lots of things, you know, very clear, concrete things that local governments have the authority to do. Much of the activity that we see in cities is around planning, and so developing climate action plans, setting targets, monitoring those targets, and trying to implement them. I think an interesting development over maybe the last 5 years or so is that more and more cities are adopting what my colleague Harriet Wolkley calls strategic urbanism. And so they're not just thinking of climate change as sort of one issue that they're dealing with, but they're actually integrating it and thinking about how it cuts across all the other issues that they're dealing with, economic development, energy, security, et cetera. And what you have in these cities now is this sort of a lot of what we call experimentation about how to reorganize infrastructure, how to provide energy in new ways, how to use renewable sources. And I think that's where a lot of the sort of exciting seeds of what's possible in the future can be found. alongside what's going on in cities, I've also been working with Matt Patterson and a number of other people looking at transnational climate governance initiatives. And essentially, that's just a way of saying these are activities that involve non-nation state, not national governments, often subnational governments and other private actors, working across national borders to coordinate their activities to try to come up with ideas about how to deal with climate change. Some examples that you may be familiar with: the International Emissions Trading Association, C40 Cities, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is the emissions trading market in the northeast of the US, the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Partnership, the Carbon Disclosure Project, the Climate Group. These are all of these entities out there. And again, these are other places where we're seeing a lot of experimentation, where you've got groups of people saying, what can we do to take on pieces of the climate problem and experiment with coming up with both new policy mechanisms as well as concrete demonstration projects to see what's going on. And so I think the potential advantages of these are I'll emphasize two at the moment. One is this sort of innovation and trying to create sort of spaces for innovation, create incentives for using new types of new forms of energy, new ways of thinking about economic development and growth, decoupling emissions from economic development and growth. So there's sites of innovation, and the challenge is how you then scale that up to make that more widespread. I think another advantage of these types of activities is to build new political coalitions that will eventually shift some of the domestic political debates in countries and perhaps give greater support for reaching more stringent agreements at the international level. I guess one of the concerns that I have or a couple of concerns that people have. One is, can this be enough? Are they effective in dealing with climate change? Are they reducing emissions? And there we simply don't know, because a lot of these initiatives either aren't explicitly about reducing emissions, they're about sort of changing practices. So you can't sort of put a number on, X amount of avoided emissions. And even those that are, cities that have set a target for reducing emissions often aren't monitoring those or using different methodologies. So there's questions about, whether this is sufficient. And, I don't think we can just sort of give up on the multilateral treaty negotiations and turn to this type of activity and say it will settle what's going on. I think there's also concern that this is potentially a way for countries to bypass taking responsibilities and to effectively sort of put the responsibility elsewhere, to devolve it to the local level, and to enroll developing countries in a way that may be against some of the equity principles that have been debated